Welcome and hello. This is a video tutorial in HEC RAS, and in this lesson, I'm going to be discussing RAS mapper terrain modifications and specifically using the National Levee Database Data, NLD data. So what that looks like is on the screen here, I've got the page to the terrain modifications. This is the RAS Mapper User's Manual. If you go to this page, and I'll leave a link in the description, and then scroll all the way towards the bottom, National Levee Database Data, this is the contents of this video lesson. Okay, so on the screen, I have my HEC RAS up and my RAS mapper. In the previous lesson, you can consider that part one. That's where we looked at terrain modification in RAS mapper, but using the geometric data cross sections that led to interpolation, importing as a new shapefile. And then the second option was to use the modification layers here in RAS mapper. But the third option is what I'm talking about here, the National Levee Database Data. The only requirements are to have a projection set. So you go up to project, set projection, and you also need to zoom in on the area of interest. To make it easier for myself, I also downloaded a terrain file. So this is my particular river of interest, and there is a levee system here. So I do have existing terrain data shown in my terrain layer that has a levee system, but I believe that the NLD data will have more accurate data. So that's what we're going to check out right now. There's really two steps involved. The first step is to actually download the files, the GeoJSONs, and then also the second step is to import the data. So the first thing we want to do is go up to RAS Mapper, click on the project menu, come down here to download data, and then go to National Levee Database Feature NLD. For the extent source, we want to select current view. That's why we zoomed in on the current view we want data for. And then also levee data. Looks like that's our only option there. So go ahead and click on query products. And it looks like I've got two options here. So I'm going to go ahead and download both of them. Whichever row has check boxes in this column here for the download button, those are the ones that will be downloaded. So we'll click download. But before we do, I just want to point a couple more things out. First of all, you can click this link over here on the far right column. And what that opened for me on my browser here is shown here. Welcome to the National Levee Database, and it gives you a lot of information about the NLD data if you're interested. So here's some quick stats, for instance. Okay. Also, what the user's manual tells me is that these checkboxes that say adjustments to ensure levee features have elevation data and ensure levee features are oriented with the system layer, that those should both be checked on. I think that makes the most sense, and it's also recommended. The data is going to be downloaded to this directory. So inside your project folder, you're going to have a downloads directory and then an NLD directory. And then inside that will be all the files. So without further ado, we can open up that folder or not after the download. I'll go ahead and click download. That downloaded apparently. Let's go ahead and check out the project folder. So here's the project folder. And then I'm going to click on downloads, NLD. Now here are all the files that downloaded, some 20 files, 19 files. These are the files that will be read in through the map layers through the new NLD layer. So let's go ahead and check that out. Over here, let's see, close. Yeah. Over to the left, we have map layers, and now we have NLD. So let me go ahead and check that on. And if I expand the NLD layer, we now have layers for RAS merged alignments. That's the one we want to check on. So we now have the levee lines you're seeing. That's this black line here, but if it's not obvious enough, we could zoom in or we could double click to change the symbology right here. I'm going to leave it as it is with the default symbology. But there's also a number of other layers, some of which may have data in this particular view. But I believe that I downloaded data for, yes, there's a much larger range of data that I downloaded, even though I'm really only interested in this area right here. Most of these I'm checking on. There's not a lot of information. There's levee area, and then also levee crossings had a number of data points. But for the most part, a lot of these just don't have too much data, at least not in my particular view. But that's all right. The RAS merged alignments are what I'm most interested in. Now it's time to actually add these to our particular geometry file. So I'm going to minimize or collapse the NLD layer and then come over here to terrain. Now I'm not going to add them directly to the terrain. I think best practices is to create a clone of the terrain, add the modifications to the clone first, and then they can be added to the master, you might call it. Right click and clone terrain virtual. It's called terrain clone. That's fine. I can call it whatever I want. And then I'm going to turn off the main terrain, turn on this terrain here. And then for this terrain clone layer, I'm going to right click and then add modification layer. Come over here to lines, and then I want to select high ground. I should get okay, there we go, high ground. Now the user manual calls this levee, so you could just call it levee yourself, or I'm going to call it high ground dash NLD data, which is essentially the same thing. Doesn't matter, it's just a name. So go ahead and click OK. Then what you want to do is right click on that new layer, import features. So that is right here, import features. You need to also be in edit mode. So for instance, make sure you're in edit mode. If there's a stop sign here, you're in edit mode. If there's an edit pencil here, you need to click that edit pencil or just right click and start editing. But I'm already editing, so that's why I have the option to stop editing. Okay, anyway, import features. And this is the last step. What we need to do is navigate to the RAS merged alignments.shp file. That was one of the 19 files that were downloaded from the NLD data database. So I'm going to select this folder icon to navigate. Let's see, this is my project folder. So click on downloads, NLD, and then I said RAS merged alignments. That's the antepenultimate file here, RAS merged alignments.shp. Okay, so the data is loaded and that looks correct. So let's go ahead and click the import button. So it looks like we're loaded. Let's go ahead and check out what some of this levee data that we imported from the National Levee Database is exactly. I'm going to, yeah, click my record for the levee and then click on edits. Now let's go ahead and highlight this particular levee segment. It looks like it extends for maybe a mile or so. There's a scale right down here. And then I'm going to go right click and then edit ground line modification. That'll bring up this dialog box here, ground line editor. And you can also get to this dialog box just by going to a right click over here, edit ground line modification. All right, so it's the same data. And what we see here, this magenta line, it tells us that the NLD data appears to be about 4 feet higher than the terrain data at that same location. And it looks like it's more than a mile. It looks like it's closer to a mile and a half, actually. But I can modify this data as I wish just by modifying the values in this table. And then, yeah, there's a ton of, okay, about almost 200 points. The modification method right here, we can either replace with the terrain value that's exclusively using this value here. The second option is to use the higher between this value and the ground level, which is why the magenta is completely following the table data here. And then if we select lower, that means magenta is going to be the lower between this table data and the ground data from the terrain layer. And then adding a value, we don't want to do that because we're adding some 40 or 45 feet. So let's just go ahead and go back to higher. I talk about this editor in a little bit more detail in the previous lesson. That's lesson 73. But on the top, we have the cross section. So this cross section right here is the cross section along the entire length of this segment of the levee. So for instance, before we say OK and save the levee changes, then we may want to make some sort of modifications by changing the top width, the side slope, or the max extent. So in the case of a levee, the max extent is going to be the width, which is 0 to 48 feet. So I'm just going to basically accept what I see here, not make any changes, click OK. And then once I'm happy with all the levees imported from the National Levee Database Data, and I want to add that to my main terrain layer, then I would just go ahead and on modifications, go right click, copy modifications to, and then select terrain because that's the only other terrain layer. I have terrain layer and I have terrain clone 1. So I'm going to copy it to terrain layer, click OK. And now the terrain layer has those modifications. Oops, okay, it took a moment. I'll just go ahead and see. Yep, so there's the same modifications that I copied over from the clone layer. Well, that's it for this lesson. What we did was use RAS Mapper and did some terrain modifications, specifically using the National Levee Database data.